The iron key felt like a stone in her palm. Cold, heavy, unyielding. Gracelyn closed her fingers around it, the metal biting into her skin as the train rattled beneath her feet. Through the soot-stained window, the landscape had transformed from the golden hills of California to something harder, more unforgiving. Wyoming territory stretched out in endless white, a frozen wasteland that seemed to swallow hope itself. She sat alone in the corner of the passenger car, her small cloth bag clutched against her chest. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that bag. $15 in coins. A faded photograph of her mother taken before the consumption had hollowed her out. And the letter. Always the letter. Grace had read it so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases, threatening to tear. The words never changed, no matter how many times she wished them different. Miss Lynn, your father's debt is $6,000. I will clear it if you become my wife's companion. A man named Cole Brennan will marry you in name. He is difficult, but you will be safe. Arrive redemption by December 10th. V. Crane. Wife's companion. The phrase was careful, deliberate. It meant nothing and everything at once. Grace was 23 years old and she understood enough about the world to know that safety was never guaranteed, especially not for a Chinese woman traveling alone into the wilderness. The train wheels clattered against the frozen tracks, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her exile. 3 weeks ago, she had been working in her father's laundry in Sacramento, her hands raw from lye soap, her future small, but certain. Then the men had come. Two of them wearing suits too fine for the neighborhood, their eyes flat and calculating as they stood in the doorway. William Lynn, the taller one had said, Mr. Crane is calling in your marker. Grace had watched her father's face crumble, watched him age 10 years in 10 seconds. He had fallen to his knees right there on the wet floor, not caring about the dignity he'd spent 40 years building. Please, he'd whispered, give me more time. I can work. I can pay. $6,000. The man had said it the way someone might comment on the weather. You gambled it away in 3 nights. Mr. Crane was generous to wait this long. Grace had known her father gambled. She'd found the betting slips, smelled the whiskey on his breath when he came home late from Chinatown. But she hadn't known about this. Hadn't known he'd mortgaged their entire lives on the turn of a card. The second man had pulled out a photograph, a blurred image of a tall man with dark hair standing next to a black horse. In the photo, the man's face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but even through the blur, Grace could see the hardness in his posture, the gun on his hip. Cole Brennan, the man had said. He works for Mr. Crane, out in Wyoming, town called Redemption. Grace had taken the photograph with trembling fingers. The man in the image looked carved from stone, immovable, dangerous. Your daughter marries him, the first man continued. Debt's cleared, simple as that. Nothing about it was simple. Grace had opened her mouth to refuse to tell them she would work double shifts, triple shifts, anything but this. But then she'd seen her father's face. The raw desperation there. The shame that had already begun to eat him alive. They'll kill me if I don't pay, William Lynn had whispered later after the men had left. Not quick. Crane doesn't do quick. He'll make it last. Make it hurt. You're all I have left, Grace. Your mother, God rest her, she'd understand. Sometimes we do hard things to survive. Grace had wanted to scream at him, to ask how he could sell his only daughter to pay for his own weakness. But the words had stuck in her throat because she'd already seen the answer in his eyes. He was already dead inside, already gone. Sending her away was just the final act of a man who'd given up. So she'd packed her bag, taken the train ticket the men brought the next day. And now, 4 days later, she was here. Rolling toward a town called Redemption, toward a man she'd never met, toward a life that felt like a coffin slowly closing. The other passengers gave her a wide berth. A few of them whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. A Chinese woman traveling alone was either a prostitute or a mail-order bride, and in their eyes there wasn't much difference between the two. Grace kept her gaze on the window, watching the snow-covered plains blur past, and tried not to think about what waited at the end of this journey. An old prospector stumbled down the aisle, reeking of cheap whiskey, even at 10 in the morning. He caught sight of Grace and grinned, showing more gaps than teeth. Redemption, eh? He'd heard the conductor call out the stops. That where you're headed, girl? Grace didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. The prospector didn't need encouragement. He leaned against the seat across from her, swaying with the motion of the train. That's Crane's town, you know. Victor Crane owns half of it. The bank, the saloon, probably the souls of every man who's ever borrowed a dollar from him. He laughed at his own joke, a wet, rattling sound. And if Crane owns the town, Cole Brennan's the devil he keeps on a leash. The prospector's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of someone sharing a particularly juicy piece of gossip. That man's killed more people than I got fingers and toes. Last year, he tracked down 5 men who robbed Crane's bank. Brought 'em all back. Every last one. Dead. Grace's fingers tightened on her bag. She wanted to tell the old drunk to leave her alone, but her voice seemed to have fled. Shot a man in the saloon last month. The prospector continued warming to his subject. Fella bumped into him by accident. Brennan broke 3 of his fingers without batting an eye, just snapped them like kindling. Man didn't even cry out, he was so scared. The train lurched around a curve and the prospector grabbed the seat to steady himself. He leaned in closer and Grace could smell the rot on his breath. You got business in Redemption, girl. You best keep your head down. Stay clear of Brennan. That man ain't right in the head. Crane keeps him around because he's useful. A mad dog on a chain. But mad dogs got a way of turning on anyone who gets too close. Grace turned to face him fully then, and something in her expression made him step back. Thank you for the warning, she said quietly. Her English was perfect, California educated, and she saw the surprise flicker across his face. He'd expected pigeon at best. The prospector muttered something and stumbled away down the aisle. Grace watched him go, then returned her gaze to the window. The sky was darkening, purple clouds rolling in from the north. A storm was coming. The train pulled into Redemption as the first snowflakes began to fall. The station was little more than a wooden platform with a sagging roof. Beyond it, Grace could see the town itself, maybe 40 or 50 buildings clustered along a single main street. Everything looked gray and weathered like the color had been leached out by the endless wind. Grace stepped down from the train, her boots crunching on the snow-dusted boards. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She'd thought she knew cold from Sacramento's winters, but this was different. This cold had teeth. It bit through her thin coat and found the bones beneath. The other passengers hurried past her, eager to get out of the weather. Within moments, Grace stood alone on the platform, her bag clutched in both hands, watching the town watch her back. Faces appeared in windows, pale ovals behind frost-covered glass. Someone pulled a curtain shut. A door closed with a sharp crack. No one came to greet her. The letter had said someone would be there, but the platform was empty, save for an old hound dog that lifted its head to look at her before deciding she wasn't worth the effort. Grace was considering her options when a boy appeared from behind the station house. He couldn't have been more than 10, dressed in clothes too large for his thin frame. He looked at her with the solemn, measuring gaze of a child who'd grown up too fast. You the China girl? He asked. No malice in the question, just a statement of fact. Grace nodded. Mr. Crane says you're to come to his office. The boy pointed down the main street. Big building, can't miss it. He turned and walked away before Grace could ask any questions. She picked up her bag and followed her boots, leaving dark prints in the fresh snow. The main street of Redemption was exactly what she'd feared. A handful of businesses, their signs creaking in the wind, a general store, a saloon with music already spilling from its doors despite the early hour, a church that looked like it was losing its battle with gravity, and at the far end, standing taller than everything else, a 2-story building with fresh paint and glass windows that actually looked clean. The sign above the door read Crane Enterprises and Banking. Grace climbed the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door opened before she could knock, and she found herself face to face with a man who looked nothing like what she'd expected. Victor Crane was handsome. That was the first shock. He had silver hair combed back from a patrician face, and he wore a gray suit that must have cost more than Grace's father earned in a year. His smile was warm, practiced the smile of a man who'd learned long ago that charm was more useful than threats. Miss Lynn, he said her name like they were old friends. Please come in out of the cold. You must be exhausted from your journey. The office was a revelation. Rich wood paneling, a Persian rug on the floor, oil paintings on the walls. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning pine. It was the office of a successful man, a civilized man. not the office of the monster the prospector had described. Crane gestured to a chair near the fire. Please sit. May I offer you tea? Coffee? No, thank you. Grace's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Crane settled into the chair across from her, crossing his legs with casual elegance. He studied her for a moment, and Grace forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. You're wondering why you're here, Crane said. It wasn't a question. I know why I'm here. My father's debt. Ah, yes, William Lynn. Crane's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if Grace hadn't seen the calculation behind it. A good man from what I understand, but he made some unfortunate choices. He gambled away money he didn't have. Crane inclined his head. $6,000 over 3 nights. Quite a streak of bad luck. But I'm not an unreasonable man, Miss Lynn. I don't believe in punishing children for the sins of their fathers. Grace waited. There was more coming. There was always more. However, Crane continued, I am a businessman. That debt exists and it must be addressed. When your father came to me begging for mercy, I saw an opportunity to help everyone involved. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, harder, more honest. I have a man who works for me, Cole Brennan. You may have heard of him. I've heard stories. I'm sure you have. Crane turned to face her. Most of them are true. Cole is a dangerous man, a violent man, but he's also a useful one. He keeps order in this town. He ensures that people pay their debts. He protects my interests. By killing people. Crane's smile never wavered. By doing what's necessary. But here's the problem, Miss Lynn. Cole lives like an animal, alone in a cabin outside town. No wife, no family, no softening influence. And a man like that, well, he becomes unstable, unpredictable. Grace felt the trap closing around her, but she couldn't see the shape of it yet. I need Cole to be stable, Crane said. I need him to have roots, something to tie him to this place to keep him focused. A wife would do that. Someone to cook his meals, keep his house, give him a reason to come home at night instead of spending his time in the saloon getting into fights. You're giving me to him. The words tasted like ash. I'm offering you a solution to your father's debt. You marry Cole in name only. You live in his cabin. You perform the basic duties of a wife. In return, your father's debt is erased. Completely. And you receive $30 a month for your own needs. $30. It was more money than Grace had ever had at one time. But it felt like the coins they put on a dead man's eyes. And if I refuse, Crane's smile finally faded, then I will collect from your father in other ways. Ways that will be far more unpleasant for everyone involved. I'm giving you a choice, Miss Lynn, an easy path or a hard one. But make no mistake, the debt will be paid. Grace looked down at her hands. They were shaking, so she folded them in her lap and tried to steady her breathing. This was happening. It was actually happening. She was about to be married to a man she'd never met, a man who broke people's fingers for bumping into him, a man who tracked down outlaws and brought them back dead. I need you to understand something. Crane said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. Cole is not a kind man. He's not a patient man. He has a temper that can turn in an instant. Your job is to stay out of his way. Cook, clean. Speak only when spoken to. Don't question him. Don't challenge him. Don't make him angry. He pulled an iron key from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Next to it, he set a small cloth purse that clinked with the sound of coins. And finally, a letter folded and sealed. The key is to his cabin. The money is for supplies. The letter is from Cole. He's expecting you. Grace picked up the letter with trembling fingers. The seal was already broken. Crane had read it first, of course. She unfolded the paper and read the words written in a harsh, angular script. Stay out of my way. Cook clean and speak only when spoken to. 10 words. That was all her future husband had to say to her. 10 words that laid out the boundaries of her new life with the precision of a surveyor marking a grave plot. Cole's cabin is 2 miles north of town, Crane said. I'll have someone drive you there tomorrow morning. Get a good night's rest. You'll need it. He pulled a small object from his vest pocket, a simple gold ring, nothing fancy. Put this on. It marks you as Cole's wife. In this town, that means no one will bother you. They wouldn't dare. The ring was heavy when Grace slipped it onto her finger. It felt like a shackle. Crane walked her to the door. One more thing, Miss Lynn. I know you're frightened. That's natural. But don't make the mistake of trying to run. Redemption is 2 days' ride from the nearest town, and Cole is very good at tracking. If you run, he'll find you. And then neither of us will be able to predict what happens next. Grace stepped out into the cold, the ring heavy on her finger, the key heavy in her pocket. The snow was falling harder now, thick white flakes that swirled in the wind and erased her footprints almost as soon as she made them. A woman was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She was perhaps 28 with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She wore a simple dress and a shawl pulled tight against the cold. I'm Mary Hartwell, the woman said. I run the boarding house and the restaurant. Mr. Crane arranged for you to stay the night with me. Grace followed Mary down the street, grateful for the silence. The boarding house was small but clean, and Mary showed her to a tiny room on the second floor. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the main street. I'll bring you some supper in an hour, Mary said. She hesitated in the doorway, clearly wanting to say more. What is it? Grace asked. Mary looked back toward the stairs as if checking to make sure they were alone. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're marrying Cole Brennan. I am. Did Crane tell you about him? Enough. Mary's expression was hard to read. There was fear there, certainly. But also something else. Doubt, maybe. Or confusion. My husband died a year ago, Mary said. John. He owed Crane money. $400 he couldn't pay. Grace waited, knowing what was coming. They said he fell off his horse, broke his neck. But John grew up on horses. He was riding before he could walk. Mary's hands twisted the fabric of her shawl. I saw Cole Brennan leaving our property that night. Saw him ride away on that black horse of his. The next morning, John was dead. I'm sorry. Everyone says Cole did it, that Crane sent him to collect, and John tried to run, and Cole hunted him down. Mary's voice cracked. But I don't know. I'm not sure anymore. Because I found John's body and there wasn't a mark on him except the broken neck. No bruises, no signs of a struggle, just the broken neck. What are you saying? Mary shook her head. I don't know what I'm saying. Just be careful, Grace. Everyone's afraid of Cole Brennan, and maybe they have good reason. Or maybe Crane wants them to be afraid. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. She left, closing the door softly behind her. Grace sat on the bed and stared at the ring on her finger. In the fading light, it looked like a band of ice. She didn't sleep that night. The saloon below the boarding house was loud until past midnight, and even after it quieted, Grace's mind wouldn't rest. She kept thinking about Mary's words, about the confusion in the woman's voice, about the missing pieces that didn't quite fit. When dawn finally came gray and cold, Grace was already dressed and ready. She'd eaten nothing. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety that couldn't tolerate food. Mary brought her a cup of coffee and some bread. The wagon's here, she said quietly. A thin man with nervous eyes waited outside with an old buckboard. He didn't speak to Grace, didn't even look at her directly. He just waited while she climbed into the back, then snapped the reins and started the horses moving. The road north was barely more than 2 ruts in the snow. They passed through the stand of pine trees, the branches heavy with white, and then the landscape opened up into a long valley. At the far end, nestled against the tree line, Grace could see a small cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray line against the white sky. The driver stopped the wagon 100 yards from the cabin. He didn't offer to help Grace down, didn't offer to carry her bag, just sat there staring straight ahead until Grace climbed down on her own. Good luck, he muttered, and then he turned the wagon and headed back the way they'd come. Grace stood alone in the snow, her bag clutched in both hands, staring at the cabin that was now her home. It was small, built from dark pine logs. A lean-to stable stood beside it, and she could see a horse inside a massive black creature that watched her with intelligent eyes. The cabin door was closed. No one came out to greet her. Grace knew she had 2 choices. She could turn around, try to run, try to get back to Sacramento somehow, or she could walk forward, into the unknown, into whatever waited behind that door. She thought of her father, thought of the debt that would crush him if she ran, thought of the men who would come in the night who would make his death slow and painful as a lesson to others. Grace walked forward. Each step felt like walking toward her own execution, but she kept moving until she reached the door. The key was in her pocket, but the door swung open before she could reach for it. Cole Brennan filled the doorway. He was taller than the photograph had suggested, well over 6 feet with shoulders that seemed to span the entire frame. His hair was black and long, falling past his collar. A short beard covered his jaw, and a scar ran down his left cheek from ear to chin, a pale line against weathered skin. But it was his eyes that stopped Grace's breath. They were gray as winter steel, and they looked at her with absolutely no expression at all. Not anger, not curiosity, nothing. Just the flat, assessing gaze of a man looking at an object he'd been told to accept. He wore a black flannel shirt and leather pants, and Grace could see the Colt 45 on his hip were worn and well used. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who'd done violence and would do it again without hesitation. Grace Lynn. His voice was deep, rough as gravel. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Come inside. He didn't help her with her bag, didn't step aside to give her room, just turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Grace to follow or not as she chose. She followed. The interior of the cabin was a single large room. A small kitchen area occupied one corner with a wood stove and a few shelves. A rough wooden table stood in the center, flanked by 2 chairs. Against the far wall was a single bed, narrow and neatly made. A fireplace dominated another wall, flames crackling behind the grate. And covering every available surface were weapons. 2 Winchester rifles hung over the fireplace. A shotgun rested in the corner. A lasso coiled on a hook. On the table, spread out like a map, were various pieces of tack and leather. The cabin was scrupulously clean. That surprised Grace. She'd expected the lair of a wild animal, but everything was ordered, organized. The floor had been recently swept. The dishes were washed and stacked. The bed was made with military precision. Cole walked to the table and picked up a small cloth sack. He tossed it to Grace and she caught it reflexively. It was heavy. Food, he said. Cook 2 meals a day. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. He pointed to the corner near the bed. Your space is there. I sleep on the floor. Grace looked at the narrow bed, then at the hard floorboards. I go out to work for Crane, sometimes hunting, sometimes other things. Don't ask me where I'm going. Don't ask what I'm doing. He walked to the wall where the weapons hung and ran his hand along the stock of one of the rifles. Don't touch the guns. Then he turned to face her fully, and Grace saw something flicker in those gray eyes. Not warmth, but maybe not complete emptiness either. We have a wedding license, he said. Crane arranged it. It's legal. You're my wife on paper. That protects you here. No one will bother you. They wouldn't dare. He paused, and Grace watched his jaw tighten. But this isn't a real marriage. You understand that. You stay on your side, I stay on mine. We're strangers sharing a roof, nothing more. Grace found her voice. It came out smaller than she'd intended. When did we marry? 3 days ago. Crane filed the papers in Cheyenne. It's done. I wasn't there. Didn't need to be. Crane knows people. Cole's expression didn't change. Is there anything else you want to know? Grace looked at him, at this stranger who was now her husband, at the scars on his hands and the gun on his hip, and the absolute stillness with which he held himself like a predator conserving energy between kills. No, she whispered. Good. He grabbed his coat from a hook by the door, a long black duster that made him look even more imposing. He shrugged into it, then picked up his hat. Where are you going? The question was out before Grace could stop it. Cole paused his hand on the door. He turned slowly, and Grace saw ice in his eyes. I told you not to ask. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk, and Grace heard his boots crunching through the snow, moving away. A few moments later, she heard hoofbeats. Through the window, she could see him riding north on the black horse, the two of them moving with a synchronized grace that spoke of years together. Grace stood alone into the cabin, her bag still clutched in her hands, and felt the weight of her new life settle over her like a burial shroud. She spent the first hour exploring her prison. The cabin was perhaps 20 feet on each side, well built, and chinked against the wind. The food supplies were meager but adequate. Dried beans, flour, salt pork, coffee. She found a small pantry tucked behind a curtain, and inside it, carefully preserved, were jars of vegetables. Someone had put up tomatoes, beans, carrots. It must have been Cole. The thought of this violent man carefully canning vegetables was so incongruous it almost made her laugh. Almost. Grace unpacked her bag in the corner he'd indicated. She spread out her few possessions. The photograph of her mother, the small medical kit her grandmother had given her filled with Chinese herbs and remedies, a spare dress, a book of poetry she'd bought years ago and carried with her everywhere. She made the bed, though it felt presumptuous to call it hers when Cole had said he'd sleep on the floor. Near the bed, she found a small wooden box unlocked. Inside were personal items, a military medal tarnished with age, a photograph of an older couple, their faces stern in the way of people who'd never smiled for a camera, and a letter folded so many times the paper had worn thin at the creases. Grace didn't read the letter. Whatever secrets Cole kept, they were his. She closed the box and put it back where she'd found it. By mid-afternoon, she was restless. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour. She put on her coat and stepped outside. The cold was brutal, but after the stifling closeness of the cabin, it felt almost cleansing. The stable drew her attention. She walked over slowly, not sure if the horse would tolerate her presence. But when she stepped into the lean-to, the great black animal turned its head to regard her with calm, intelligent eyes. "Hello," Grace said softly. She'd learned from her grandmother that animals understood tone if not words. The horse nickered a low, friendly sound. Grace moved closer, extending her hand so the animal could smell her. After a moment, it pressed its soft nose against her palm. She found a brush hanging on the wall and began to gently curry the horse's coat. The animal leaned into the strokes, clearly enjoying the attention. Grace worked in silence, losing herself in the simple, repetitive motion. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear Cole return until he was standing in the doorway of the lean-to watching her. Grace's hands froze. She turned slowly, expecting anger, expecting to be told she'd violated some unspoken rule by touching his horse. But Cole's expression wasn't angry, it was complicated. Something moved behind his eyes, some emotion she couldn't quite name. "His name is Midnight," Cole said quietly. "He's 9 years old. I found him when he was a colt after his mother was killed by a mountain lion." Grace weighted the brush still in her hand. "He doesn't usually like strangers," Cole continued. He moved closer and Grace could smell snow and pine and leather on him. "But he seems to like you." He reached out and ran his hand along Midnight's neck, and Grace saw something in that gesture that shattered every assumption she'd made. His touch was gentle, tender, the touch of a man who cared deeply, who understood fragility and valued it. "You can brush him when I'm gone," Cole said. He'd like that. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving Grace standing in the stable with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Because nothing about that interaction fit with the man Crane had described. A violent, temperamental killer didn't speak to his horse with that kind of softness, didn't touch an animal with that kind of care. Grace finished brushing Midnight, her thoughts churning. She returned to the cabin to find Cole sitting at the table cleaning one of his rifles with methodical precision. He didn't look up when she entered. Grace found the ingredients for a simple stew and set to work. She'd learned to cook from her mother, and the familiar motions calmed her nerves. She chopped dried vegetables, added them to a pot with water, and salt pork, set it on the stove to simmer. When the stew was ready, she ladled out 2 bowls and set them on the table. Cole put aside his rifle and sat down. He ate in silence, his movements efficient and precise. Grace sat across from him, forcing herself to swallow each bite. When he was finished, Cole set down his spoon and looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. "The stew's good," he said. Just 2 words, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Cole stood and carried his bowl to the wash basin. He rinsed it, dried it, put it away. Then he grabbed a blanket from a shelf and spread it on the floor near the fireplace. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow I'll show you where the well is, how to work the stove properly, where the supplies are kept in town." He lay down on the floor, his back to her, and within minutes his breathing had slowed to the steady rhythm of sleep. Grace sat at the table for a long time, watching the fire flicker and listening to the wind howl outside. She thought about Mary's words, about the confusion and doubt, about the stories that didn't quite add up. And she thought about the gentle way Cole had touched his horse, the care he'd taken with his home, the precision with which he'd cleaned his weapon, not like a man eager for violence, but like a man performing a necessary duty. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety. Grace climbed into the narrow bed, still fully dressed, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, full of dreams she wouldn't remember in the morning. She woke to the sound of movement. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the windows, turning the darkness to gray. Cole was already up, dressed, adding wood to the fire. He moved with absolute silence, every motion controlled and deliberate. Grace sat up and Cole glanced over his shoulder. "Coffee's ready," he said. "I'll be back by noon." He was gone before she could respond. Through the window, she watched him saddle Midnight with practiced ease, mount up, and ride out into the pre-dawn darkness. Grace poured herself coffee and sat at the table trying to understand her situation. She was married to a man she didn't know, a man everyone feared, a man who supposedly killed without hesitation. And yet, in the quiet moments she'd observed him, she'd seen nothing but control, carefulness, even gentleness. The days fell into a pattern. Cole left early and returned late. Grace kept the cabin, clean-cooked meals that he ate without comment, and spent her hours reading or caring for Midnight. They spoke rarely and then only about practical matters. Do we need more flour? The roof needs patching. The stove is smoking. But Grace watched, and she began to notice things. Cole never drank in the cabin. She found that strange, given that most men she'd known kept a bottle handy. But Cole's only vice seemed to be coffee, which he drank black and strong. He kept his weapons meticulously clean, but they were always stored away from the bed, never within easy reach while he slept. He slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, but he never seemed afraid. Just alert, always alert. On the third day, Grace found a small bird outside the cabin door. It had a broken wing and was dying in the snow. She picked it up carefully, meaning to end its suffering quickly, but the door opened and Cole stepped out. He saw the bird in her hands and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Cole reached out and gently took the bird from her. His large, scarred hands cradled the tiny creature with impossible delicacy. "I can make a splint," he said quietly. Grace watched transfixed as he carried the bird inside. He found a small twig and a strip of cloth, and with infinite patience he set the bird's wing and secured it. Then he placed the bird in a small wooden box, lined it with fabric scraps, and set it near the warmth of the fire. "It might not survive," he said, not looking at Grace. "But it has a chance now." He went back outside to resume whatever task he'd been doing, leaving Grace standing in the cabin, staring at the box with the injured bird. This was not the behavior of a mindless killer. This was not the action of a man who broke people's fingers for sport. This was something else entirely. On the fifth day, Grace made chicken soup. She'd found a dried chicken in the pantry and used it to make a rich broth, adding vegetables and herbs from her grandmother's medical kit. The scent filled the cabin warm and comforting. When Cole came in that evening, he paused in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, just breathing in the smell. "My mother used to make soup like this," he said finally. His voice was rough, like the words hurt coming out. He sat at the table and Grace served him. He ate slowly, and when he was finished, he set down his spoon and looked at her. "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they were the first real words he'd spoken to her. Not commands, not instructions, just simple, honest gratitude. Grace felt something shift between them in that moment. The wall was still there, high and thick, but maybe it had a crack in it now. A small one, barely visible, but there. That night, as Cole settled onto his blanket on the floor, he spoke into the darkness. "I've had Midnight since he was 6 months old," he said. "Found him after Indians raided a ranch up north. His mother was dead. He was so small I could carry him. I raised him on oat mash and creek water." Grace lay still, barely breathing, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had loosened Cole's tongue. "He's the only family I've got," Cole continued. "The only thing in this world that doesn't fear me or hate me or want something from me." Silence stretched out. Grace thought he was done, but then his voice came again, quieter now. "I'm not good with people. I know that. I'm better with animals. They don't lie. They don't pretend. You know where you stand with them." More silence. Then so quietly, Grace almost didn't hear it. I'm sorry you got pulled into this, into Crane's games. If I could have stopped it, I would have. Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, wanted to say something, but she didn't know what. So she stayed silent, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the man she'd been told to fear was actually the man she should trust. On the seventh day, Grace woke to find the cabin empty. This wasn't unusual. Cole often left before dawn. But when she went outside, she found him standing in the snow, staring at something near the tree line. Grace walked over and Cole pointed without a word. A fox lay in the snow, its leg caught in what looked like a trap someone had set and forgotten. The animal was still alive, but weak, its breath coming in shallow pants. Grace expected Cole to put it out of its misery. That would have been the practical thing. The kind thing, even. Instead, she watched as he knelt in the snow and carefully opened the trap. The fox was too weak to run. Cole picked it up, cradling it against his chest, and carried it back to the cabin. He set it in a box near the fire the same way he'd done with the bird. Then he disappeared into the stable and returned with a strip of wood and some bandages. Grace watched as he splinted the fox's leg with the same gentle precision he'd used on the bird's wing. His hands, which were supposed to break bones, were setting them instead. When he was done, Cole sat back on his heels and stared at the fox for a long moment. Crane says I'm a monster, he said quietly. Maybe he's right. Maybe that's all I am. Grace knelt beside him. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, she voluntarily entered his space. A monster wouldn't save a fox, she said. Cole turned to look at her, and Grace saw something raw and hurting in his eyes. You don't know what I've done. No, Grace agreed, I don't. But I know what I see, and I see a man who cares for broken things. For a long moment they stayed there, kneeling side by side in front of the box with the injured fox. Then Cole stood abruptly and walked to the door. I need to go to town, he said. For supplies, you should come. You need to know where things are. It was the first time he'd invited her anywhere. Grace nodded and grabbed her coat. They rode into Redemption together, Grace sitting behind Cole on Midnight's broad back. She had to hold onto his coat to keep her balance, and she could feel the solid muscle of his back, the controlled strength in his body. The town was just as cold and unwelcoming as it had been on her arrival. People stared as they rode down the main street. Conversations stopped. Doors closed. It was as if death itself had come to call, and everyone wanted to be indoors when it passed. Cole stopped in front of the general store and dismounted. He helped Grace down, his hand gentle despite its size and strength, and together they walked inside. The store went silent the moment they entered. The owner, a man named Wilson, turned pale and began stammering something about how good it was to see Mr. Brennan, how he hoped everything was to his satisfaction, how if there was anything at all, he needed just to name it. Cole ignored the nervous chatter. He moved through the store selecting items with quiet efficiency. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt. He added them to the counter and Wilson tallied the cost with shaking hands. While Cole was paying, a drunk man stumbled in from the street. He was young, maybe 25, and clearly didn't know what he was walking into until it was too late. He bumped into Midnight, who was tied outside but visible through the window. The horse shifted slightly and the drunk man cursed. Damn animal, the drunk muttered. Get out of the way. The entire store went dead quiet. Cole turned slowly, his hand dropping to rest on his belt near his gun. His eyes had gone flat and cold. Apologize to the horse. The drunk man blinked suddenly, much more sober. What? You heard me. Apologize. The young man looked around wildly as if searching for help, but everyone else in the store had found somewhere else to look. I didn't mean... Cole took a step forward. Just one. But the menace in that single movement made the drunk man stumble backward. Apologize. To the horse, now. The man practically fell to his knees outside, stammering apologies to Midnight, who looked more confused than offended. When Cole finally nodded, the drunk ran down the street like his life depended on it. The store remained silent as Cole finished paying. Wilson didn't ask for the full amount. He just accepted whatever Cole handed him and thanked him profusely. Outside, Grace watched Cole check Midnight for any injury, running his hands over the horse's legs and flanks with careful attention. It was only when he was satisfied that his horse was unharmed that he relaxed slightly. People think you are a monster, Grace said quietly. Cole didn't look at her. Let them think it. Why true I am? Because it's easier this way. But Grace was beginning to understand the reputation was a shield, a way to keep people at a distance, a way to avoid the messiness of human connection when all you'd known was loss. They were preparing to leave when Mary Hartwell appeared from her restaurant across the street. She waved at Grace and after a moment's hesitation approached. "Grace," Mary said, nodding politely to Cole without quite meeting his eyes. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough." Mary's gaze flickered to Cole, then back to Grace. "Would you like to have coffee?" "Just for a few minutes, I have some fresh bread." Grace looked at Cole. He gave a barely perceptible nod. "10 minutes," he said. Then he led Midnight toward the livery, leaving the two women alone. Inside Mary's small restaurant, the warmth was immediate and welcoming. Mary poured coffee and cut thick slices of bread, slathering them with butter. "How is he?" Mary asked quietly. "Cole, I mean. Has he? He's been nothing but civil," Grace said honestly. "More than civil, he's been kind in his way." Mary's expression was conflicted. "I don't understand that man. Everyone says he killed John. That Crane sent him to collect the debt, and John refused, and Cole hunted him down. But, Grace prompted, but I can't make it fit. When I found John, he looked peaceful, like he'd just gone to sleep, and his horse was there untouched. His rifle was still in its scabbard. If Cole had chased him down, shot him, there would have been signs. Wouldn't there?" Grace thought about the man who set splints on birds and foxes. "Maybe Cole didn't kill your husband. Maybe something else happened. Then why does everyone believe it? Because they want to believe it. Because Victor Crane wants them to believe it." Mary's eyes widened slightly. "You think Crane is lying about Cole?" "I think Crane benefits from people being terrified. And a terrifying man is more useful than a gentle one." Before Mary could respond, the door opened and Cole stepped inside. His presence filled the small space immediately. Mary tensed, but Cole simply looked at Grace. "Time to go." Grace thanked Mary for the coffee and followed Cole outside. As they rode back to the cabin, she found herself thinking about pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. A man with a reputation for violence who tended to broken animals. A wife who died mysteriously with no signs of struggle. A town held captive by fear. And at the center of it all, Victor Crane. Smiling, charming, and perhaps more dangerous than anyone realized. Back at the cabin, Cole helped her unload the supplies. He worked in his usual silence, but Grace noticed he kept glancing at her as if trying to decide whether to say something. Finally, as he was putting away the last of the flour, he spoke. "Crane told you I have a temper." It wasn't a question. "He did." Cole leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "He tells everyone that. It's part of my value to him. The unpredictable gunslinger. The mad dog he keeps on a leash. Is it true? I've killed men, 23 of them over 8 years as a bounty hunter. Every single one was wanted by the law. Every single one got a chance to surrender." Cole's jaw tightened. "But I've never hurt an innocent person. Never raised a hand to a woman or a child. Never killed a man who wasn't trying to kill me first." "Then why does Crane say otherwise?" "Because fear is currency in a place like this. Crane owns the bank, the saloon, half the businesses. He loans money at rates that guarantee people can't pay back. And when they can't pay, he sends me to collect." "But you don't actually hurt them." "I don't have to. They're already so terrified of what they think I might do that they find a way to pay. They sell their land, their possessions, everything they have. Crane gets rich, and I get to be the monster everyone whispers about." "Why do you stay?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. "Because 5 years ago, I tried to leave. Crane fabricated evidence that I'd killed a merchant in Denver, had me arrested, told me I could either work for him and he'd make the charges disappear, or I could hang for a murder I didn't commit." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So you chose to stay?" "I chose to survive. Same as you." He pushed away from the counter and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Your father owes Crane $6,000, but you should know Crane will never really clear that debt. He'll say he has on paper, but he'll always hold it over you. That's how he works. He keeps people trapped." Grace moved to stand beside him. "Then we're both prisoners." "Yes, They stood there in silence watching the first stars appear. And for the first time since arriving in Redemption, Grace didn't feel quite so alone. But that fragile peace was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The second week brought a different kind of cold. Not just the physical bite of Wyoming winter, but the cold realization that Grace's life had narrowed to these four walls, this silent man, this endless white landscape that stretched in all directions like a frozen ocean. She woke each morning before dawn, started the fire-made coffee. Cole would appear from his place on the floor already dressed, moving with that eerie silence that made her wonder if he ever truly slept. He'd drink one cup of coffee, standing by the window, watching the darkness thin to gray, then he'd be gone. The door would close. Midnight's hooves would crunch through the snow, and Grace would be alone. The cabin was clean. She'd scrubbed every surface in those first days, partly because there was nothing else to do, partly because the work kept her hands busy, and her mind from dwelling on how completely her life had been sold away. But now even that task was done, and the hours stretched endlessly. The bird with the broken wing had died on the fourth night. Grace had woken to find Cole kneeling beside its box, his shoulders curved inward in a posture of defeat. He'd buried it behind the cabin, without a word, digging through frozen earth with his bare hands until they bled. But the fox survived. After a week, when its leg had healed enough, Cole released it back into the wild. Grace watched from the cabin windows as the creature limped away into the trees, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the forest. Cole stood in the snow for a long time and after his hands in his pockets, watching the place where the fox had vanished. Grace saw herself in that moment. The fox had been trapped, injured, dependent on the kindness of a captor who might or might not be dangerous. But it had healed, and it had been set free. Maybe she thought there was hope for her yet. A few days later, Cole surprised her. "We're going to town," he said over breakfast. "You need to know where things are, in case something happens to me." Grace looked up from the bread she was kneading. "What would happen to you?" Cole shrugged into his coat. "Crane's work isn't always safe. You should be able to get supplies on your own." It was the most he'd said to her in days. Grace wiped the flour from her hands and reached for her shawl. The ride to Redemption was different this time. Grace sat behind Cole on Midnight, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. She could feel the solid strength of him, the controlled power in his body. He rode like he did everything else. Efficiently, precisely, no wasted motion. The town looked smaller in daylight, less menacing. Just a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the wilderness. But the reaction to their arrival was the same. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People hurried inside. A woman pulled her child off the street as they passed. Cole tied Midnight outside the general store and helped Grace dismount. His hand was steady on her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that were supposed to break bones. Inside the store, Mr. Wilson's nervous chatter filled the silence. He fell over himself to be helpful, to anticipate Cole's needs, to make sure everything was perfect. Grace watched the old man's hands shake as he wrapped their purchases in brown paper. This was power, she realized. Not the kind that came from money or position, but the raw, primal power of fear. Everyone in this town was terrified of Cole Brennan. And yet in 2 weeks of living with him, Grace had seen nothing to justify that terror. They were leaving the store when it happened. A young man, clearly drunk despite the early hours, stumbled down the street. He careened into Midnight, who shifted slightly to avoid being knocked over. "Damn horse," the drunk muttered, steadying himself against the hitching post. "Get out of my way." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cole went absolutely still, and Grace saw something flicker in his eyes, not rage. Something colder, more controlled. "Apologize to the horse." Cole's voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden silence. The drunk looked up, and the color drained from his face as he recognized who he was dealing with. What? You heard me." Cole took a step forward. Just one. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but the threat was there nonetheless. Implied. Terrible. "Apologize to the horse. Now." The young man practically fell to his knees in the snow, stammering out apologies to Midnight, who looked more bemused than offended. The horse nickered softly and nudged the man's shoulder as if accepting the apology. Only then did Cole nod. "Go home. Sleep it off." The drunk fled down the street and the town went back to pretending Cole Brennan didn't exist. But Grace had seen something in that exchange. The way Cole's hand had never touched his gun. The way he'd given the man a chance to make it right instead of just punishing him. The way he'd cared more about his horse's dignity than his own fearsome reputation. This wasn't the behavior of a violent, unstable man. This was something else entirely. Mary Hartwell appeared as they were preparing to leave. She moved with the careful caution of someone approaching a dangerous animal, but there was determination in her eyes. "Grace," Mary said, her gaze flickering to Cole in a way, "could I speak with you just for a moment?" Cole gave a barely perceptible nod and led Midnight toward the water trough. Grace followed Mary into the small restaurant, grateful for the warmth and the smell of fresh bread. Over coffee, Mary's careful composure cracked. "Is he treating you well, Cole, I mean? Has he—" She couldn't seem to finish the question. "He's been nothing but respectful," Grace said honestly. "He sleeps on the floor. He speaks little but never unkindly. He's teaching me about the supplies the town how to survive out here." Mary's confusion was written clearly on her face. "I don't understand him. Everyone says he killed John. That Crane sent him to collect the debt, and John refused to pay, and Cole hunted him down like an animal." She twisted her cup in her hands, staring down at the dark liquid. "But I saw John's body. There was no blood, no bullet wounds, just a broken neck. The doctor said he fell from his horse, but John was the best rider in the county. He'd been riding since he was 5 years old." Grace leaned forward. "What if the story everyone believes isn't true? What if Crane wants people to think Cole killed your husband? Why would he do that? Because fear is a weapon, and a man everyone's terrified of is a man Crane can use." Mary's eyes widened, but before she could respond, the door opened. Cole stood silhouetted against the bright snow, his presence immediately filling the small space. Mary tensed her hands, gripping the coffee cup so hard Grace thought it might shatter. "Time to go," Cole said quietly. On the ride back to the cabin, Grace felt the weight of all the pieces that didn't fit. A man with a reputation for brutal violence who apologized to drunk men and tended to injured animals. A death with no signs of struggle. A town paralyzed by fear that seemed to benefit only one man. Victor Crane. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Cole did something unexpected. He stayed at the table instead of retreating to his work or his silence. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat there staring into it like he might find answers in the dark liquid. Grace cleared the dishes, hyper-aware of him in the small space. Finally, she couldn't stand the tension anymore. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Cole's hands tightened around the cup. "Crane didn't give me a choice. He gives everyone choices. Terrible choices, but choices nonetheless. Not this time." Cole looked up at her, and Grace saw something raw in his eyes. "He told me your father owed $6,000. That if I didn't marry you, he'd sell you to a brothel in Cheyenne to cover the debt. He showed me the paperwork. It was already arranged." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. "I couldn't let that happen," Cole continued, his voice rough. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but I couldn't let that happen to you, so I agreed." Grace's throat tightened. All this time, she'd thought Cole was just another part of Crane's trap, but he'd been trying to save her in the only way he could. "Thank you," she whispered. Cole shook his head. "Don't thank me. I still brought you here, still trapped you in this life. I should have found another way." There was no other way. We both know that. Silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Less hostile, more like two prisoners acknowledging they shared a cell. "Crane told me you have a terrible temper," Grace said carefully. "That you're unpredictable, dangerous. He tells everyone that." Cole's jaw tightened. "It's my value to him. The mad dog on a leash. People are so afraid of what I might do that they'll pay anything, sell anything just to avoid finding out." "But you don't actually hurt them." "No, I just let them think I will." He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "I've killed 23 men in my life. Every single one was wanted by the law. Every single one was given a chance to surrender. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. They made their choices." "What about John Hartwell?" Cole went very still. "I didn't kill John Hartwell." "But you were there. Mary saw you leaving their property the night he died. I was there because Crane sent me to collect $400. I found John in the barn. We talked. I gave him a week to find the money. He thanked me. He was alive when I left. Cole turned to face her, and his expression was haunted. The next morning he was dead. Broken neck. The doctor said he fell from his horse. But you don't believe that. John Hartwell rode better than most men walk. He wouldn't fall. Not like that. Grace's mind raced. Then who killed him? I don't know, but I know who benefits from everyone thinking it was me. Crane's grip on this town got a lot tighter after John died. People became a lot more willing to pay their debts. The implications settled over Grace like a shroud. Crane is using you, your reputation, even murders you didn't commit. Yes. Why don't you leave? Why not just run? Cole's laugh was bitter. I tried. 5 years ago. I'd saved enough money that had a plan to head to California, start over. Crane found out. Within a week, I was arrested for murdering a merchant in Denver, a man I'd never met, a town I'd never been to. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Crane had witnesses, forged documents, everything needed to see me hanged. He visited me in jail and made me an offer. Work for him and the charges disappear. Refuse and I swing. So you chose to live. I chose to survive. Like you did. Like everyone in this town does. Cole's eyes met hers. We're all prisoners here, Grace. The only difference is what kind of chains we wear. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind howl outside and Cole's steady breathing from the floor. Her mind churned with questions and half-formed plans. There had to be a way out of this. For both of them. She must have finally dozed off because she woke to the sound of hooves thundering in the snow. Grace sat up disoriented. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Cole was already on his feet moving to the window with the silent speed of a predator. Stay here, he said, his voice tight. Then he was out the door, moving into the night. Grace ignored his order. She grabbed her shawl and followed. The sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold. Midnight was down in the snow, his great body convulsing. Cole was on his knees beside the horse, his hands moving frantically over the animal's distended belly. No, 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 Cole was murmuring, his voice breaking. Not you, please, not you. Grace ran to them, her medical training from her grandmother, suddenly the only thing that mattered. She'd seen this before in horses back in California. Colic. The twisted intestines that could kill a horse in hours if not treated. We need to get him up, Grace said, dropping to her knees in the snow. Keep him moving. It's the only chance. Cole looked at her with wild, desperate eyes. He won't get up. I can't make him get up. Then we work here. Grace's mind raced through everything her grandmother had taught her. I need hot water. Ginger if you have it. Clean cloths. Cole ran to the cabin and returned within minutes, his arms full. Grace worked quickly, mixing a paste of ginger and warm water. She showed Cole how to massage the horse's belly, working in slow, firm circles to try to ease the blockage. They worked through the night. Cole held Midnight's head, murmuring to him in that gentle voice Grace had heard before. Words of love, promises, desperate pleas. I found you when you were just a baby, Cole whispered against the horse's neck. Your mama was dead and you were so small. I didn't think you'd make it, but you did. You're strong, the strongest thing I know. You can't leave me now. You're all I have. Grace's hands never stopped moving, applying pressure to the swollen belly, massaging in the patterns her grandmother had taught her. She'd watched her grandmother save 3 horses this way. She had to believe it would work now. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Midnight's breathing changed. The convulsions eased. Slowly, miraculously, the swelling began to subside. Keep talking to him, Grace instructed. He needs to hear your voice. Cole pressed his forehead against Midnight's neck, his shoulders shaking. Grace realized he was crying. Silent, wrenching tears that he'd probably been holding back for years. Come on, boy, Cole whispered. Come back to me. Please come back. Just as the sun crested the horizon, Midnight lifted his head. Then with Cole and Grace supporting him on either side, he struggled to his feet. He stood there shaking but alive. Cole collapsed against the horse's side, his arms wrapped around Midnight's neck. His whole body trembled with relief and exhaustion and emotions he'd probably never let himself feel before. Grace stepped back, giving them privacy. Her hands were numb from the cold, her clothes soaked through with snow and sweat, but none of that mattered. They'd saved him. They'd actually saved him. After several minutes, Cole pulled away from Midnight and turned to Grace. His face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do, I would have lost him." "You would have figured it out," Grace said gently. "You love him. That counts for something." Cole shook his head. But ain't always enough. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and Grace saw vulnerability in his eyes that she'd never expected. "You saved him. You saved the only family I have." Grace moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You're not alone anymore, Cole. You have me now, too." Something shifted in Cole's expression. The walls he'd built so carefully began to crack. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Maybe not, but you have it anyway." They stood there in the snow as the sun rose midnight between them, and for the first time since Grace had arrived in redemption, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth fighting for. The days after Midnight's recovery were different. Cole still left early and returned late, but the silence between them had softened. He started staying at the table after dinner, drinking coffee and watching Grace read by the fireplace. Sometimes he'd tell her about his day, where he'd ridden, what he'd seen. He never talked about the work he did for Crane. That remained a locked door between them. But everything else slowly opened up. "I was born in Kentucky," Cole said one evening unprompted. "My father was a blacksmith. My mother taught school. They were good people, honest people." Grace set down her book and listened. In 1867, they took the train to Denver to buy supplies. On the way back, the Dalton gang robbed the train, killed 12 people. Cole's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "My parents were two of them." "I'm sorry." "I was 20 years old, just discharged from the Union Army. I spent the next 3 years tracking down every member of that gang, brought them all in, every single one. And then I became a bounty hunter, figured if I was good at finding people, might as well get paid for it. Did that for 8 years, made good money, saw a lot of the West." He paused. "Killed a lot of men. But they were all outlaws, all wanted by the law." "Yes, but that doesn't make it easier to live with." Cole looked at her. "I got tired of it. Tired of the killing. Tired of watching my own humanity slip away piece by piece. So I came here. Thought I could buy some land, raise horses, live quiet. And then Crane found you. And then Crane found me." Cole's smile was bitter. "Turns out you can't outrun what you are. The man who's good at killing will always be asked to kill. The only question is whether you get paid in money or freedom." Grace stood and moved to sit across from him at the table. "What if we could prove Crane is lying about the murders he's pinning on you? About John Hartwell? About all of it?" Cole shook his head. "Crane owns the law in this town. The sheriff is on his payroll. The judge in Cheyenne owes him money. There's no one to prove anything to." "What about the U.S. Marshal?" "They're federal. They don't answer to Crane. The nearest marshal is in Cheyenne, 100 miles away. And even if we could get word to him, what would we say? That everyone's afraid of me, but I'm actually innocent, that the most respected man in town is really a criminal?" "What if we had proof?" Cole studied her face. "What kind of proof?" "I don't know yet, but there has to be something. Records, witnesses, something that shows what Crane really is." For a long moment, Cole said nothing. Then he stood and walked to a shelf near his bed. He pulled out a small leather journal and brought it back to the table. "I've been keeping notes," he said quietly, "for 5 years. Every job Crane sends me on. Every debt he collects. Every person who mysteriously disappears or dies right after owing him money." He opened the journal and Grace saw pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Dates, names, amounts, details. "I didn't know what I was going to do with it," Cole continued. "Just felt like someone should remember, should bear witness to what was really happening." Grace turned the pages carefully. The entries painted a damning picture. Loans with interest rates that made repayment impossible. Property seized for debts that didn't match the original amounts. People who challenged Crane or refused to pay, who then met with accidents or simply vanished. "This is evidence," Grace said. "This could bring Crane down. Only if we can get it to someone who cares, someone with the power to act." Then we find a way to do that. Cole looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're saying. If we go against Crane, if we try to expose him, he'll come after us with everything he has. He'll kill us if he can. Or worse. What's worse than death? Watching everyone you care about die first. Grace met his eyes without flinching. I have no one left to lose. My mother is dead. My father sold me to pay his gambling debts. I'm already living in exile. The only thing I have left is the chance to do something that matters. You have me, Cole said quietly, for whatever that's worth. Grace reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was rough and scarred, but his grip was gentle. Then we protect each other, and we find a way to be free. A few days after Midnight's recovery, Victor Crane came to the cabin. Grace saw him coming from the window. A fine horse, an expensive coat, that same charming smile that hid poison underneath. Cole was out checking his trap lines and Grace was alone. She considered not answering the door. But Crane would just come back, and next time, Cole might be here. Better to face him now on her terms. She opened the door to find Crane's smile already in place. Mrs. Brennan, he said as if they were old friends. May I come in? It's frightfully cold out here. Grace stepped aside without a word. Crane entered, his gaze sweeping the cabin's interior. She saw him note the embroidered cloth on the table, a piece from her mother's handiwork that she'd unpacked a few days ago. His smile thinned slightly. How domestic, Crane said. I'm pleased to see you're settling in. What do you want? Direct. I like that. Crane moved to the fireplace, warming his hands. I came to check on my investment. Your father's debt is cleared as promised. But I like to ensure that the arrangements I make are working out for everyone involved. The arrangements are fine. Are they? Crane turned to face her. Because from what I hear, you and Cole are becoming quite close. You saved his horse, I understand. Very touching. Grace said nothing. Every instinct told her this was a trap. I need you to understand something, Mrs. Brennan. Crane's voice hardened. Cole is a tool, a useful one, but a tool nonetheless. His value lies in his reputation, in people being terrified of what he might do. If that reputation softens, if people start to see him as anything other than a monster, then his usefulness to me diminishes. What does that have to do with me? Everything. You're making him soft. I can see it already. He's spending more time at the cabin, less time making the rounds, reminding people why they should fear him. That's a problem. Crane stepped closer and Grace fought the urge to back away. I put you here to keep him stable, not to domesticate him. Cole needs to remain dangerous, unpredictable, the kind of man people have nightmares about. Do you understand? I understand that you're using him, using both of us. Of course I am. That's what power is, my dear. The ability to use people for your own ends. Your father understood that when he sold you to clear his debt. The words were meant to hurt, and they did. But Grace kept her expression neutral. Is there anything else? Crane studied her face, and Grace saw calculation in his eyes. Yes. One more thing. Your father borrowed another $2,000 last month from a gentleman in Sacramento who happens to be an associate of mine. Grace's blood ran cold. That's impossible. Gambling debts, I'm afraid. He has 6 months to repay, or I've been authorized to collect. From him or from any family member who might be inclined to help. Crane's smile was a razor. Just so you know where things stand, your cooperation ensures your father's continued health. Do we understand each other? Perfectly. Excellent. Crane moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mrs. Brennan. A word of advice. Don't mistake Cole's current docility for safety. He's killed 23 men that we know of. When he snaps, and he will snap, eventually he makes sure you are not in his path. He left and Grace stood frozen in the center of the cabin. The trap had tightened, not just around her, but around her father too. Crane was making sure she had no choice but to comply. No choice but to keep Cole isolated, dangerous, exactly the weapon Crane needed. When Cole returned an hour later, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Grace was sitting at the table staring at nothing, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. What happened? He was at her side in an instant, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Grace told him everything, about Crane's visit, his threats, the new debt hanging over her father's head like a sword. Cole's expression went dark with fury, but when he spoke, his voice was controlled, deadly calm. He came here alone to my cabin. He wanted to remind me of my place. He wanted to threaten you, to make sure you stay scared. Cole's hands clenched into fists. I should kill him. Right now. Ride into town and put a bullet in his head. And then what you hang for murder. I'm left here alone. My father still owes the debt. Crane wins even from the grave. Cole paced to the window, his whole body radiating tension. I can't let him keep doing this. Keep hurting people. Hurting you. Grace stood and moved to him. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the coiled muscles beneath. Then we don't play his game. We change the rules. Cole turned to look at her. How? We find someone who can help. Someone Crane doesn't control. We get your journal to them along with testimony from people he's hurt. We build a case that even his money can't buy his way out of. The nearest marshal is in Cheyenne. Then we go to Cheyenne. It's 100 miles in winter, through mountain passes that could be closed by snow. And Crane would know we were gone within hours. He'd send men after us. Maybe there's another way. Grace thought of Mary Hartwell, of the uncertainty in her eyes when she talked about her husband's death. Maybe there are people in this town who would stand with us if they knew the truth. Cole shook his head. They're too afraid. Fear can be overcome. If the alternative is worse than what they're already enduring. For a long moment, Cole said nothing. Then he pulled Grace into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her with surprising tenderness. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, he murmured against her hair, or the most foolish. Grace leaned into his warmth. Maybe both. That night they talked until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. They made plans, identified potential allies, discussed risks and contingencies, and somewhere in those hours of quiet conversation, the space between them dissolved entirely. When Grace finally climbed into bed, Cole was still sitting at the table studying his journal by candlelight. She watched him for a moment, this man who everyone feared, who had shown her nothing but gentleness and respect. Cole, she said softly. He looked up. Yes, I'm glad I came here. I know that's strange to say given how I ended up in redemption, but I'm glad it was you I was sent to. I'm glad I met you. Cole's expression softened in the candlelight. So am I, Grace. So am I. Grace closed her eyes, and for the first time since leaving California, she felt something like hope. The next morning brought a blizzard. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing trying to tear the cabin apart. Cole went out 3 times to check on midnight, each time returning coated in white ice forming in his beard. The storm's getting worse, he said after the 3rd trip. We're stuck here for at least 2 days. Being trapped together in the small cabin should have been uncomfortable, but instead Grace found it almost peaceful. They worked together to keep the fire going to make meals from their limited supplies. Cole showed her how to play poker with a worn deck of cards he kept in a drawer. Grace taught him a Chinese game her grandmother had shown her using pebbles and marks in the dirt floor near the fireplace. In the forced intimacy of the storm, they talked about everything. Cole told her about growing up in Kentucky, about learning to ride before he could read, about the way his mother's voice had sounded when she sang. Grace shared memories of her own mother, of the tight-knit Chinese community in Sacramento, of the discrimination they'd faced and the small rebellions they'd staged. I always wanted to be more than what people expected, Grace said. More than just a laundry worker's daughter. My grandmother used to say I had healing hands, that I should study medicine. But Chinese women don't become doctors in America. Maybe they should, Cole said quietly. On the 2nd night of the storm, the temperature dropped so low that the fire couldn't keep the cabin warm. Cole built up the flames as high as he dared, but still Grace shivered under her blanket. Without a word, Cole took his own blanket and added it to hers. Then he positioned himself between her bed and the door, the coldest spot in the cabin. You'll freeze, Grace protested. I've slept in worse, I'll be fine. But an hour later, Grace could hear his teeth chattering. She made a decision. Cole, she said softly, come here. He turned to look at her, confused. Grace held up the edge of the blankets. We'll both freeze if we're separate. Shared warmth is practical. That's all. For a moment, Cole didn't move. Then slowly he stood and moved to the bed. He lay down on top of the covers, keeping a careful distance between them, and Grace pulled the blankets over both of them. The warmth was immediate, but more than that, Grace felt safe, protected. For the first time since her mother had died, she didn't feel alone in the world. "Thank you," Cole murmured. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for seeing past what everyone else sees." Grace shifted slightly closer. "I see you, Cole Brennan, the real you, and I'm not afraid." She felt his hand find hers under the blankets. Their fingers intertwined, and they fell asleep like that two broken people finding our comfort in each other's warmth. When Grace woke the next morning, Cole was already up, but the memory of his warmth remained. And when he looked at her across the cabin, there was something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. The storm broke on the third day, leaving the world crystalline and still. The snow was so deep that midnight could barely move through it, but the sky was clear, brilliant blue, and the sun turned everything into diamonds. Cole took Grace outside to see it. They stood together on the cabin's small porch, breathing in the clean, cold air, and Grace felt something shift inside her. This wasn't her prison anymore. It was becoming her home, and the man beside her wasn't her jailer. He was becoming something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet but felt with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, whatever they had to face with Victor Crane, they would face it together. Not as prisoner and captor, but as partners, as equals, as something that might in time become even more than that. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. The morning after the storm broke, Grace woke to find Cole already dressed, standing by the window, with that peculiar stillness he had. The kind that made him look like a statue carved from stone, immovable and eternal. But she knew better now. She'd felt him trembling in the cold, heard him whisper his fears to a dying horse, seen the gentleness in hands everyone said were made for killing. "We need to talk to Doc Rivers," Cole said without turning around. "If anyone in this town has the courage to stand against Crane, it's him." Grace sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "You trust him?" "He pulled a bullet out of my shoulder during the war. Shiloh, 1862. I was 19 years old and stupid enough to think I was immortal." Cole's hand unconsciously moved to his left shoulder. "He saved my life then. Maybe he'll help save it now." "When do we go?" "Tonight, after dark. Can't risk Crane's men seeing us together." Cole finally turned to face her, and his expression was grave. "Grace, if we do this, if we really go against Crane, there's no turning back. He'll know, and he'll come for us with everything he has." "I know. You could still walk away. I could put you on a train to California, give you money to start over somewhere Crane can't reach." Grace stood and crossed to him. She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of a hard life lived on the edge of violence. "I'm not leaving. We're in this together now." Something flickered in Cole's eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. He squeezed her hands gently. "Then we'd better make sure we win." They spent the day preparing. Cole cleaned his weapons with meticulous care, checking each round of ammunition, testing the action of his rifle. Grace went through her grandmother's medical kit, making sure she had supplies for whatever might come. Bandages, herbs for infection, willow bark for pain. The practical preparations for a battle neither of them wanted, but both knew it was inevitable. As the sun set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Cole saddled Midnight. "We'll ride together. Stay close to me. If anything happens, you get on this horse and you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run." "Cole, promise me, Grace." His voice was steel. "Promise me that if it comes to that, you'll save yourself." Grace wanted to argue, but she saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but for her. So she nodded, even though she knew it was a lie. Even though she knew that if it came to a choice between her safety and his, she'd make the same choice he would. She'd fight. Redemption looked different at night. The buildings were dark shapes against darker sky, and the few lit windows glowed like distant stars. Cole guided Midnight through the back streets, avoiding the main road where Crane's men might see them. They moved in silence, just the soft crunch of hooves and snow and the whisper of wind through empty spaces. Doc Rivers lived in a small house behind his clinic, and lamplight showed through the curtains. Cole dismounted and helped Grace down, then tied Midnight to a post where the horse could be hidden by shadows. Cole knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. Some kind of signal, Grace realized. A moment later, the door opened. Samuel Rivers was older than Grace had expected. nearly 60 with white hair and a face lined by years of seeing suffering and trying to ease it. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and they widened when he saw Cole standing on his doorstep. "Cole Brennan," Doc said quietly. "It's been a long time." "Too long. Can we come in?" Doc's gaze moved to Grace, taking in her presence with the assessing look of a man who missed nothing. "This must be your wife. Mary Hartwell mentioned you'd married." He stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Quickly now, if Crane's men see you here." The interior of Doc's home was cluttered but clean. Medical books lined one wall. A fire burned low in the grate. On the table sat a half-eaten dinner and an open journal filled with precise handwriting. "Forgive the mess," Doc said, clearing space at the table. "I don't get many visitors. Most people in this town would rather suffer in silence than be seen entering a doctor's house after dark. They're afraid Crane will think they're complaining about something he's done." Cole and Grace sat, and Doc poured coffee without asking if they wanted it. The silence stretched as he settled into his own chair, his eyes moving between them with that same assessing look. "You're here because you want to take down Victor Crane," Doc said finally. It wasn't a question. Cole's surprise showed for just a moment. "How did you know about him now?" "Because I've been waiting 15 years for someone to try him." Doc stood and moved to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a key, opened it, and removed a leather-bound ledger. "I've been keeping records. Every suspicious death, every injury that didn't match the official story, every time Crane's version of events didn't align with the medical evidence." He placed the ledger on the table between them. Cole opened it, and Grace leaned in to read over his shoulder. Page after page of meticulous notes, names, dates, causes of death both official and suspected. A catalog of Crane's crimes written in a doctor's careful hand. "John Hartwell," Doc said, pointing to an entry dated 14 months ago. Official cause of death was a broken neck from a fall, but the break pattern was wrong. It was clean, too clean. The kind of break you get from a deliberate snap, not a fall. And there were pressure marks on his throat, barely visible, but there. Someone choked him until he passed out, then broke his neck to make it look like an accident. Grace felt cold settle in her stomach. "Did you tell anyone?" "Who would I tell? The sheriff is on Crane's payroll. The judge in Cheyenne owes him money. I wrote to the U.S. Marshal's office 3 times. Never got a response." Doc's expression was bitter. "Crane owns this whole territory, or might as well." Cole pulled out his own journal and set it beside Doc's ledger. "I've been keeping records too. Every collection job, every debt, every person who disappeared or died after refusing to pay." Doc read through Cole's entries, his face growing darker with each page. "This is damning. This is enough to put Crane away for life. But we need to get it to someone who can act on it, someone outside Crane's reach." "The marshal in Cheyenne," Grace said. "If we can get these documents to him in person, make sure he actually reads them and understands what Crane has done, he'd have to investigate." "Cheyenne is 100 miles away," Doc said, "through mountain passes that are dangerous in winter. And the moment Crane realizes you're gone, he'll send men after you." "Then we need a distraction," Cole said. "Something to keep Crane's attention here while we make the journey." Doc was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. What if Crane thought there was a threat right here in town, something that demanded his immediate attention? What kind of threat? Me. Doc's smile was grim. "I'm the town doctor. If I suddenly fell gravely ill, Crane would need to be seen caring for me. It would look suspicious if he didn't. He'd have to stay close, make a show of concern. It might buy you the time you need." Grace shook her head. "That's too dangerous. If Crane suspects you're helping us." "I'm an old man with not much left to lose, and I've been complicit in Crane's crimes for too long, signing death certificates I knew were lies, keeping silent when I should have spoken." Doc's voice was firm. "Let me do this. Let me finally do something that matters." Cole studied the old doctor's face. "If we do this, we need more than just a distraction. We need witnesses, people willing to testify about what Crane has done to them." "Mary Hartwell would testify," Grace said. "She told me she's not sure anymore that you killed her husband. If we can show her the evidence, prove that Crane was behind it, she'd stand with us." "Anyone else?" Cole asked. Doc thought for a moment. "Wilson, who runs the general store. Crane foreclosed on his original property and sold it back to him at 3 times the price. He's bitter, but scared. If he saw others standing up, he might find his courage. The blacksmith Thomas Green, Cole added. His son disappeared 2 years ago after getting into a fight with one of Crane's men. The official story was that he ran off, but Thomas never believed it. He might talk if he thought it would lead to answers. They spent the next hour planning. Doc would feign illness starting tomorrow, claiming chest pains that required complete rest. Crane would have to be seen visiting, playing the concerned patron. While Crane was distracted, Cole and Grace would quietly gather testimony from Mary Wilson and Thomas. Then when they had enough evidence and witnesses lined up, they'd make the run to Cheyenne. It's not a perfect plan, Doc admitted. There are a dozen ways it could go wrong. But it's better than doing nothing, Grace said. Better than letting Crane keep destroying lives. Cole stood and extended his hand to Doc. Thank you for everything. Doc shook his hand firmly. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Victor Crane is behind bars where he belongs. They left through the back door, moving quickly through the shadows. But as they reached midnight, Grace heard something. A footstep, the soft scrape of leather on wood. Cole, she whispered. He heard it too. His hand moved to his gun, and he positioned himself between Grace and the sound. A figure emerged from the darkness, and Grace's heart hammered in her chest. But it wasn't one of Crane's men. It was Mary Hartwell, wrapped in a dark cloak, her face pale in the moonlight. I saw you come this way, Mary said quietly. I've been watching Doc's house. I hoped you were planning something. Cole's hand didn't leave his gun. You followed us. I want to help. Mary stepped closer and Grace could see tears on her face. John was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. And I've been a coward for too long, too afraid to ask questions, too scared to demand answers. But I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Grace moved to Mary and took her hands. It's dangerous. If Crane finds out you're helping us, then I'll face whatever comes, but I won't stay silent anymore. Mary's voice was steady despite her tears. Tell me what you need. Tell me how I can help. Cole exchanged a look with Grace and she saw the question in his eyes. She nodded. They needed allies and Mary's testimony about her husband's death would be powerful. We're gathering evidence against Crane, Cole said quietly. We're going to take it to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne, but we need people willing to testify, to tell the truth about what Crane has done, even if it's frightening. I'll testify, Mary said immediately. I'll tell them about John, about the debts Crane claimed he owed, about how the numbers never made sense, about finding him dead with a broken neck when he was the best horseman in the county. It might mean facing Crane in court, Grace warned, looking him in the eye and accusing him. Good, Mary's expression hardened. I want to see his face when his lies finally catch up to him. They brought Mary back to Doc's house and she added her statement to the growing pile of evidence. By the time they finished, dawn was threatening on the eastern horizon. Cole and Grace rode back to the cabin as the sky lightened to gray, both of them exhausted, but feeling something they hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, real tangible hope that maybe they could actually do this. The next 3 days were a careful dance. Doc Rivers began his performance, clutching his chest during his morning rounds and allowing Wilson to help him back home. Word spread quickly through Redemption. The doctor was ill, very ill, possibly dying. Crane played his part perfectly. He visited Doc twice a day, bringing food and medicine, making a great show of concern. It was masterful manipulation, Grace realized. If Doc died, Crane would be seen as a caring benefactor who'd done everything possible. If Doc recovered, Crane would get the credit. While Crane was distracted, Grace and Cole worked quietly. They visited Thomas Green in his smithy where the hammer blows provided cover for their conversation. The blacksmith's hands shook as he told them about his son Michael, who'd gotten into a fight with one of Crane's men over a card game. The official story was that Michael had fled town rather than face charges. But Thomas had found his son's horse 3 days later, still saddled, wandering alone in the hills. Michael's rifle was in its scabbard. His canteen was full. He'd never gotten wherever he was supposedly running to. I know Crane killed my boy, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I've known it for 2 years, but I couldn't prove it, and I was afraid if I pushed too hard, I'd end up dead too. Cole showed him the journal entries. The patterns of people who'd crossed Crane and then disappeared. The way debts were manipulated. The violence hidden behind accidents and natural causes. Thomas read it all, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'll testify. I'll tell the marshal everything. Even if it costs me my life, Michael deserves justice. Wilson at the general store was harder to convince. He was older, more cautious, and Crane's grip on his livelihood was absolute. But when Grace pointed out that his own children would inherit nothing but debt if things continued as they were, something shifted in his eyes. I have receipts, Wilson said finally, from the original loan, from when Crane foreclosed. The numbers don't match what Crane claimed I owed. I kept them hidden, afraid to show anyone. But if you're really going to the marshal, I want him to see them. By the fourth day, they had 7 people willing to testify, 7 voices that would tell the truth about Victor Crane. Combined with Cole's journal and Doc's medical records, it was a case that even Crane's money and influence couldn't dismiss. The plan was set. They would leave before dawn the next day, riding hard for Cheyenne. Doc would keep Crane occupied with his illness. Mary and the others would stay quiet until the marshal arrived. If everything went right, they'd be back with federal authority before Crane even knew they were gone. If everything went right. That night, Cole and Grace sat together at the cabin table going over the plan one last time. The journals were wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather. Grace had packed food and medical supplies. Cole had checked every round of ammunition, every buckle on Midnight's tack. They were as ready as they could be. We should get some sleep, Cole said. We'll need to leave by 4 to get enough distance before Crane realizes we're gone. But neither of them moved. Grace looked at Cole's face in the firelight, memorizing the lines and scars, the gray eyes that had seemed so cold when she first arrived and now seemed to hold warmth she'd never expected to find. Cole, she said quietly, if something goes wrong tomorrow, if Crane catches us or we don't make it to Cheyenne, I want you to know something. Don't talk like that. I need to say it. Grace reached across the table and took his hand. These past few weeks with you have been the first time in my life that I felt like I mattered. Not as a daughter who was a burden, not as a debt to be paid, but as a person, as someone worthy of respect and kindness. And she trailed off, not quite able to say the word that was burning in her chest. Cole's hand tightened on hers. Grace, he swallowed hard. I've killed men. I've done things I'm not proud of. I'm not a good man. You're wrong, Grace's voice was firm. You're the best man I've ever known. You took me in when you could have refused. You protected me. You've shown me gentleness when you could have shown cruelty. You saved a dying fox, Cole. A fox, that's not the action of a bad man. Cole stood and moved around the table. He knelt beside her chair, bringing it himself to eye level. I love you, he said, and his voice broke on the words. I didn't mean to, didn't plan for it, but somewhere between you saving Midnight and you standing up to Crane and you looking at me like I'm worth something, I fell in love with you. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. I love you too. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. If we survive this, if we actually manage to bring Crane down and make it out alive, I want to do this right. I want to marry you for real. Not on paper in some office in Cheyenne, but with you choosing me and me choosing you. I choose you now, Grace whispered. Cole pulled her close and she felt his heart hammering against her chest. Then whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. They held each other as the fire burned down to embers, neither willing to let go. Both knowing that dawn would bring a reckoning they might not survive. Grace must have dozed off because she woke to Cole's hand gently shaking her shoulder. It's time. The world outside was still dark, that deep darkness that comes just before dawn. Stars glittered overhead, cold and distant. Grace dressed quickly, her hands shaking with a combination of fear and adrenaline. Cole saddled Midnight with practiced efficiency, securing the saddlebags that held their evidence and supplies. Grace climbed up first and Cole swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. She leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. Ready, he murmured against her hair. Ready. They rode out of Redemption, heading east toward the mountains that stood between them and Cheyenne. The road was treacherous in winter, but Cole knew these paths. He'd ridden them for 5 years, learning every turn, every dangerous stretch, every place where the snow might hide a deadly drop. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Cole suddenly pulled Midnight to a halt. Grace was about to ask why when she heard it too. Hoofbeats behind them. Multiple horses moving fast. They know, Cole said grimly. Crane knows we're gone. Grace turned to look back and saw them. 5 riders, maybe 6 still distant, but closing fast. Crane's men, coming to stop them by any means necessary. Hold on, Cole said, and urged Midnight into a gallop. The great horse surged forward, his powerful legs eating up the ground. But they were carrying 2 riders, and the men behind them were lighter faster. Slowly but inexorably, the gap closed. Cole guided Midnight off the main road and into a narrow canyon. It was a gamble. The canyon would slow their pursuers, but also box them in if they got trapped. But Cole seemed to know where he was going, and Grace trusted him. They rode hard through the canyon, Midnight's hooves throwing up sprays of snow. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. A gunshot rang out, the bullet whining off the rocks above their heads. They're not trying to scare us, Cole said. They're trying to kill us. He pulled Midnight behind a large boulder and dismounted quickly. Stay with the horse. If I go down, you ride out the north end of this canyon. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just ride. Cole no. But he was already moving, taking cover behind a fallen tree with his rifle in hand. Grace watched, her heart in her throat, as the first of Crane's men rode into view. Cole didn't give them a chance to shoot first. He fired once, and the lead rider's horse went down, throwing its rider into the snow. Not a kill shot. Cole had aimed for the horse's leg, disabling the pursuit without taking a life. The other riders scattered, taking cover. For a moment, there was silence except for the wind and the injured man's groans. Brennan, a voice called out. Grace recognized it. Deputy Collins, one of Crane's most loyal men. Give it up. Hand over whatever you took, and Crane says we'll let you live. Crane's word isn't worth the air it takes to speak it, Cole shouted back. Go home, Collins. This doesn't have to end with anyone dying. Can't do that. Crane pays too well. Another gunshot, this time from Cole's rifle. It hit the rock inches from where Collins was hiding, showering him with stone chips. A warning shot. Perfect accuracy. Next one won't miss, Cole called. I've got enough ammunition to pin you down until nightfall, and I know every inch of this canyon. You don't. Your choice. Grace saw movement to her left. One of Crane's men was trying to circle around, using the rocks for cover. She didn't think. She grabbed Cole's pistol from the saddlebag, the one he'd taught her to shoot during their quiet afternoons at the cabin. The man emerged from cover, raising his rifle toward Cole's back. Grace fired. The recoil shocked her, making her arms ring. But the bullet found its mark, hitting the man's shoulder and spinning him around. He dropped his rifle and fell back behind the rocks, cursing. Cole spun around, saw Grace with the smoking pistol, and something like pride flashed across his face. Good shot. I was aiming for his chest, Grace admitted. Even better. You wounded him without killing him. Cole turned back to face their attackers. Collins, one of your men is hit. You want more blood on your hands, or you want to go back and tell Crane you tried, but we got away. Silence. Then Collins's voice sounding less certain. Crane will kill us if we come back empty-handed. Crane will kill you eventually anyway. That's what he does. You've seen the pattern. Cole's voice was steady, reasonable. But if you walk away now, you stay alive. Live to see Crane fall, because he will fall. We have evidence. Witnesses. We're taking it to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. More silence. Grace could almost hear the mental calculations happening behind the rocks. 5 men, maybe 6 against Cole Brennan, a man with a reputation for killing 23 bounty hunters without breaking a sweat. Was Crane's money worth dying for? Finally, Collins called out again. I'm not dying for Victor Crane. Men were pulling back. Smart choice, Cole said. They waited tense as the sound of hoofbeats retreated down the canyon. Only when the silence was complete did Cole lower his rifle and return to Grace. You could have been killed, he said, but there was no anger in his voice. Only awe. So could you. Grace was shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with her. I couldn't just watch. Cole pulled her into his arms, and they stood there for a long moment holding each other while Midnight waited patiently. We need to keep moving, Cole said finally. Collins might have backed off, but Crane will send more men, and next time they might not be willing to negotiate. They rode hard for the next 6 hours, stopping only to rest Midnight and let him drink from the ice-cold streams that cut through the mountains. The path grew steeper, more treacherous, but Cole navigated it with the confidence of someone who knew every turn. By late afternoon, they'd crossed the highest pass and begun the descent toward Cheyenne. In the distance, Grace could see the town spread out in the valley below. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys. The setting sun painted the buildings gold. "Almost there," Cole said. "A few more hours and we'll be at the marshal's office." But Grace felt a prickling at the back of her neck, the sense that something was wrong. She turned to look behind them and saw nothing but empty trail. Yet the feeling persisted. "Cole," she said quietly, "I think we're being followed." He didn't question her instinct. He just urged Midnight to move faster, guiding the horse off the main trail and into a thick stand of pine trees. They waited there in the growing darkness, hardly breathing. Two riders passed by on the trail below. They were dressed differently than Crane's usual men, better armed, more professional. Hired guns, Grace realized. Crane had sent killers. "They're heading to Cheyenne," Cole whispered. "They'll set up there, wait for us to show up at the marshal's office." "It's a trap." Grace's mind raced. "Then we don't go to the marshal's office. Not directly. Is there somewhere in town we can hide?" "Someone who might help us," Cole thought for a moment. "There's a boarding house on the east side, run by a widow named Sarah Thompson. I brought in a man who'd robbed her 5 years ago. She might remember." "It's a risk." "Everything about this is a risk." Cole looked at her. "But I trust your instincts. If you think we're being followed, we are. We'll go around, come into Cheyenne from the north and find Sarah's place. From there, we can figure out how to get to the marshal safely." They waited until full dark before moving again. The town of Cheyenne was bigger than Redemption, with gas lamps lighting some of the streets and the sound of piano music drifting from the saloons. They entered from the north as planned, moving through residential streets where fewer eyes would see them. Sarah Thompson's boarding house was a neat two-story building with yellow curtains in the windows. Cole knocked softly on the back door, and after a moment it opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and sharp eyes. "Cole Brennan," she said, her voice neutral. "It's been a long time." "Mrs. Thompson, I need help." Sarah looked past him to Grace, taking in her exhausted state and the fear in her eyes. Something softened in the older woman's expression. "Come inside, quickly." She ushered them into a warm kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee. Only when the door was locked and the curtains drawn did she speak again. "I heard you got married to a Chinese girl. Folks said it was strange Cole Brennan having a wife." "This is Grace," Cole said, "and what we have is real no matter what people say." Sarah poured coffee and set out bread and cheese. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Cole told her everything. About Crane, about the evidence, about the men hunting them even now, waiting to kill them before they could reach the marshal. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When Cole finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "Victor Crane, I should have known. That man has his fingers in everything from here to Denver." She stood abruptly. "Stay here, I'll be back in an hour." "Mrs. Thompson, I know the marshal. Jackson and I go way back. If anyone can get you to him safely, it's me." Sarah grabbed her coat. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." She was gone before Cole could protest. They sat in her kitchen, exhaustion finally catching up with them, and waited. True to her word, Sarah returned exactly 1 hour later. But she wasn't alone. With her was a man in his mid-40s wearing a star on his chest. Marshal William Jackson. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the saddle and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Brennan," the marshal said, extending a hand, said, "Saws. Thompson tells me you have evidence of crimes committed by Victor Crane." Cole shook his hand and pulled out the journals. 5 years of evidence, plus testimony from 7 witnesses willing to swear to what they've seen. Marshal Jackson sat at the table and began reading. His expression grew increasingly grim as he turned the pages. When he reached Doc Rivers' medical records, he swore softly. "This is enough to hang him 3 times over," the marshal said. "Murder, extortion, fraud, witness intimidation." He looked up at Cole. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" "Because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Because Crane has his hooks in everyone from here to Denver. Because I was a coward." Cole's voice was stern. "But I'm not anymore." Jackson closed the journal carefully. "I'll need those witnesses to testify. Can you get them here?" If I go back to Redemption, Crane will know. He'll disappear, or worse, he'll kill everyone who agreed to testify. And then I'll come to you. Jackson stood. I'll deputize a dozen men. We'll ride to Redemption tomorrow at dawn. We'll arrest Crane, and we'll do it so publicly that he won't have a chance to run or threaten anyone. He looked at Cole. But I need you there, as a witness, as someone who can identify his men and testify to what you've seen. I'll be there. Jackson turned to Grace. Ma'am, you should stay here, where it's safe. No, Grace said firmly. I'm going back too. Those people risked everything to help us. I won't abandon them now. The marshal studied her face, then nodded slowly. You're braver than most men I know, Mrs. Brennan. They left before dawn, a group of 15 riders moving fast through the mountain passes. Marshal Jackson led the way with Cole and Grace riding together on midnight near the middle of the group. The other riders were deputized citizens of Cheyenne, men Jackson trusted to stand firm, even in the face of Crane's money and threats. They reached Redemption by mid-morning. The town looked peaceful in the thin winter sunlight, but Grace could feel the tension underneath, like a string pulled too tight waiting to snap. Marshal Jackson deployed his men strategically. 2 guarded each exit from town. 4 surrounded Crane's office. The rest formed a perimeter around the main street. Then Jackson walked up to Crane's door and knocked. Victor Crane opened it himself, his usual charming smile already in place. But it faltered when he saw the marshal's star. Faltered more when he saw Cole and Grace standing behind Jackson. Marshal, Crane said smoothly, what an unexpected pleasure. How can I help you? Victor Crane, you're under arrest for murder, extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. Jackson's voice carried down the street, and Grace saw doors opening, faces appearing in windows. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you. Crane's smile vanished. This is absurd. On whose authority? Mine, and the authority of the territory of Wyoming, and the testimony of 7 witnesses who are willing to swear to your crimes. Crane's eyes found Grace, and she saw rage there. Pure, undiluted rage. You, he hissed. You ungrateful little. Careful, Cole said quietly, stepping forward. His hand rested on his gun. Threatening a witness in front of a U.S. Marshal is a good way to add years to your sentence. You're a dead man, Brennan. Both of you. My men are already in custody, Jackson said. We rounded them up an hour ago. Collins Harris, all of them. They were remarkably willing to testify against you in exchange for reduced sentences. Grace watched the color drain from Crane's face, watched him realize that his empire built on fear and violence was crumbling in a matter of minutes. I want a lawyer, Crane said. You'll get one. In Cheyenne, after you stand trial. Jackson gestured to his deputies, who moved forward with manacles. Crane looked at the gathered crowd as the chains went on his wrists. People he'd controlled for years. People he'd bled dry with his loans and threats. And not one of them looked sympathetic. Not one of them stepped forward to defend him. As Jackson led Crane toward the horses, the townspeople began to emerge from their homes. Grace saw Mary Hartwell standing on her porch, tears streaming down her face. Saw Thomas Green at his smithy, hammer in hand, watching the man who'd killed his son being led away in chains. Saw Wilson at his store, his wife beside him, both of them standing tall for the first time in years. Doc Rivers appeared from his house, no longer feigning illness. He walked directly to Grace and took her hands. You did it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You actually did it. We all did it, Grace replied. Every person who was brave enough to speak the truth. The trial took place 3 weeks later in Cheyenne. Grace and Cole testified along with Mary Thomas Wilson and 4 others. Doc Rivers presented his medical evidence. Marshal Jackson detailed the results of his investigation, which had uncovered even more of Crane's crimes. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They found Victor Crane guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in territorial prison. Given Crane's age, it was effectively a life sentence. As they led him away, Crane looked at Cole one last time. You think you've won, he said, but you'll never escape what you are. You'll always be the killer, the monster, no matter how this turned out. Cole met his gaze steadily. Maybe, but I'd rather be a monster who fights for justice than a respectable man who profits from suffering. Crane had no answer to that. Grace and Cole stayed in Cheyenne for a week after the trial, helping Marshall Jackson tie up the loose ends of the case. Crane's assets were seized and distributed among his victims. The people of redemption began the slow process of rebuilding their lives without his shadow over them. On their last night in Cheyenne, Cole took Grace to a small church on the edge of town. A minister waited there along with Sarah Thompson and Marshall Jackson as witnesses. "I know we're already married on paper," Cole said, "but I want to do this right. I want to make vows that mean something." The ceremony was simple, no fancy words or elaborate rituals, just Cole and Grace standing together in front of God and witnesses choosing each other freely and completely. "I, Cole Brennan, take you, Grace Lynn, to be my wife. I promise to protect you, to honor you, to stand by your side through whatever comes. You saved my life in more ways than one. You showed me that I was more than what people feared. You gave me hope when I thought I was beyond redemption." Grace's hands trembled as she held his. "I, Grace Lynn, take you, Cole Brennan, to be my husband. I promise to stand with you, to believe in you, to see you for who you truly are. You gave me safety when I had none. You showed me that strength and gentleness can exist in the same person. You taught me what it means to be truly free." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Cole kissed Grace, it felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. They decided not to return to redemption. Too many ghosts there, too many memories of being Crane's prisoners. Instead, they bought a small piece of land in Montana, 300 miles north, far enough to start fresh, but close enough to the mountains Cole loved. With the money from Crane's seized assets that the court had awarded to his victims, they had enough to build a modest house and start a horse ranch. Cole would train horses using the gentleness he'd always had, but rarely showed. Grace would use her grandmother's medical knowledge to help the scattered settlers in the area. On their first morning in their new home, Grace woke to find Cole already up, standing on the porch and watching the sunrise. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Fighting Crane, the trial, everything we risked." Cole pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders. "Not for a second. For the first time in my life, I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. I don't have to be the monster in people's nightmares. I can just be me." "And who is that?" He smiled and it transformed his face. "I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm a man who loves his wife, who wants to build something good, who believes that the past doesn't have to define the future." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think that's a good place to start." They stood there as the sun rose higher, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. Midnight grazed peacefully in the field below, and smoke rose from their chimney carrying the promise of warmth and home. Victor Crane was in prison. The people of redemption were free, and Grace and Cole had each other. Not because of a debt or a contract or a manipulation, but because they'd chosen each other again and again through fear and danger and impossible odds. "You know what the best part is?" Cole said quietly. "What? This isn't the end of our story, it's just the beginning." Grace smiled and squeezed his hand. He was right. Everything they'd been through, all the pain and fear and struggle, had brought them to this moment, to this place, to this chance to build a life that was truly their own. Freedom, Grace realized, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was having someone who would fight beside you to break them. It was finding love in the most unlikely place. It was discovering that the monster everyone feared was actually the gentlest soul she'd ever known. And as the sun climbed higher over their new home, Grace knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Two people who'd been sold and traded and used by others, who'd finally found a way to belong to themselves and to each other, always.